Some important things to note. All right, so this screencast is about macromolecules. This is kind of macromolecules part two. I couldn't make it have been a ginormous screencast. So this one is about the three different classes of macromolecules we're going to consider right now: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Now, some things I want you to pay attention to and maybe make some notes about, like what are the elements that we find here, and what are the ratios of those elements? What are the things that they have in common? Things that they have in common. What about their names? There are some names and some suffixes in particular that help give you clues as far as whether it's a protein or a carbohydrate or a lipid. Some things to pay attention to is what's their function, what are their jobs, and then what are their monomers, and what are some examples of polymers of each of these different macromolecules: the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the lipids. So the first group of macromolecules we're going to talk about right now are carbohydrates. So number one, they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So no nitrogen, no phosphorus, no sulfur in these. All right, so the carbohydrates you can see over on that second piece of pie are about what, 12, 14, 15% of the macromolecules we find in living things. So you and I are made of about that percentage. About 10, 15% of our cells are made of that. So carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And one of the things you need to be aware of is the ratio of hydrogen to oxygen. So take a look at those two formulas. C6H12O6, that's glucose, and then C12H22O11, that's sucrose. So what do you notice about the ratio of hydrogen to oxygen? Yeah, that's right. It's 2 to 1. So that's a clue. When you're looking at a molecular formula, that'll really clue you in as far as, okay, is this a carbohydrate or a lipid in particular? That if the ratio of hydrogen to oxygen is 2 to 1, it's a carbohydrate. So carbohydrates, ooh, sugars and starches. It's the holiday season, right? And so we're putting sugar on all kinds of stuff, on bundt cakes and things like that. Monosaccharides like fructose, which we find in honey. Well, that's one of the reasons why some people don't like honey, because it's way too sweet, because fructose by itself is really, really sweet. Now, when you mix it up with some other stuff and make high fructose corn syrup and add some sucrose to it, you can put it in sodas, and it's not too sweet. Although some people do find pop and soda too sweet anyway, probably because it has to do with the amount of high fructose corn syrup that's in it. Other kinds of polysaccharides. So sucrose, which is table sugar, so here I've got some cubes of sugar. You can see it's crystalline in form. So that's a polysaccharide. So monosaccharides are simple sugars. Those are the monomers of it. So glucose is a monomer of starches and carbohydrates, those kinds of things. Starches we find in breads and potatoes and corn and rice. Those kinds of things are high in carbohydrate, and they're all starches, big long chains of monomers. Polysaccharides also, probably the most important polysaccharide, the most important carbohydrate on the planet, is cellulose. If you're taking notes right now, you're writing on cellulose, right? That came from a tree. So cellulose, which comes from cell walls of plants, is the most prolific carbohydrate on the planet. There are some other kinds of carbohydrates. I flashed a mushroom. Sorry, I went past that. Mushrooms are made of a carbohydrate called chitin. And the cell walls are made of chitin, not the whole mushroom. But then chitin is also found in insects and shrimp. Shrimp cocktail, fried shrimp. Yeah. So the carapace, the shell of all the insects, arthropods, those types of organisms, is made of carbohydrate. So carbohydrates have a couple of important functions. Number one, energy, right? So we need sugars for energy, starches for energy. But they also form very important structural molecules, like for cell walls in plants, or the shell of an insect, or a lobster, or a crab, or a shrimp, right? So structure and energy, important functions for carbohydrates. Another important thing to think about is that where do carbohydrates come from? Well, they come from photosynthesis. So we take carbon dioxide and water and light. Plants have the ability to take those things, and they make sugars and oxygen, right? So there's a sugar molecule. Cellular respiration, on the other hand, that's what you and I do since we don't do photosynthesis. Cellular respiration releases all that stored energy that's been stored by the plants. So we take sugars and oxygen, and what do? Well, we get some cellular energy, plus we exhale carbon dioxide and we breathe out water and we go to the bathroom, right? We micturate, so we urinate. Another important carbon-based molecule are lipids, and they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So if we look at the slice of pie, it's even smaller. It's even smaller than the carbohydrates. So less than 10% of macromolecules are lipids. Now, lipids are important. They're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They're non-polar, which means they don't have a charge. Lipids probably a new term for you, but I bet you've heard of fats, oils, and waxes and cholesterols. They're mostly made of carbon and hydrogen, and that's what makes them nonpolar. They don't have a charge to them. They don't stick to things, right? So what do you put on your car? Maybe you wax your car, right? So waxes are waterproof. Oils float in water, nonpolar, don't react with water. So, right? So dairy products, right? Eggs don't come from cows, but eggs are loaded with fats. Oils, right? So plant fats. We squeeze olives, we squeeze corn and soybeans, and all kinds of other plant products, seeds to get oils from them. We also have waxes. So here's the beeswax, right? So you maybe have some beeswax products in your life. Right? So waxes are a type of lipid. Lipids have a bunch of different functions. So these big cells, so these big oval shaped, round shaped things, those are fat cells. The yellow that's in the middle of those, that's actually fat. So you and I, have these fat cells all over our body, and they store energy, right? Um, they also have the ability, so fat has an insulative property to it, right? So here's a whale that's living in cold waters, and there's lots of blubber, which is fat. It insulates things. It's also found membranes around cells, so it helps to form important structures to segregate not only cells, but the inside of cells. It breaks it up into smaller and smaller pieces too, with membranes around membranes, which is really, kind of segregates reactions. It also, excuse me, different types of lipids are hormones or vitamins, right? So testosterone, right? So testosterone helps you build muscle. Well, that's a lipid. It's a lipid. It's a nonpolar molecule that when you inject too much of it or when you use it can help you build muscle. So hormones and vitamins are different types of lipids as well. Now, not all hormones are lipids, so we'll have to desegregate that. We'll kind of pull that apart a little bit. So we've got carbohydrates, we've got lipids, and now we're going to talk about proteins. So proteins are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen. So we've got, instead of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen now, we have sulfur and nitrogen. So if you see sulfur and nitrogen in a molecular formula, you'll know that it's a protein. The monomers of proteins are amino acids, and when you take amino acids and you fold them up, if you have a long chain of amino acids and fold them up, you make a protein. And if you remember back in that illustration, about 60% of the mass of macromolecules in cells. So proteins do all kinds of things in cells. They're really the workhorses of cells in terms of the jobs that they do and the functions that they perform for cells. So if we look at number one, they can form contractile things, so like muscles. I'll slap some images up here in a second. They also, hopefully you've heard about antibodies with coronavirus. They'll help fight diseases. Enzymes do chemical reactions. Hormones like insulin, right, that help put glucose into your cells and get it out of your bloodstream. They're structural, like collagen and elastin that you find in your skin, or keratin, which is found in your hair. They also store, it's just a storage molecule. So in milk is full of a protein called casein. Now when you treat that with different chemicals like vinegar or maybe different molds, you can make really nice cheese out of it too. But they also transport things. So they're found in membranes and they help move things in and out of cells. So here's some images, right? So when the proteins that we find in our muscles contract when they get shorter, they help you move things, right? So here we've got a picture of somebody doing some curls. Antibodies, the Y-shaped things that are green that are attacking this coronavirus. Enzymes, the purple molecule there that has a specialized shape that attaches to substrates and makes a product. Or insulin, right? So insulin is a chemical that's produced in your pancreas. Um, if you have something wrong with your insulin, right, you have to rely on injections of insulin. So people that are diabetic. Here's keratin. So keratin is a structural protein. We find it in our hair and fingernails. This woman has beautiful keratin, right? She's obviously taking good care of it. So cheese is made of casein. We're going to do a cheese lab. I don't know if it'll be before or after Christmas, but we're going to do a cheese lab where we will isolate casein, add some salt to it. It'll be tasty. It'll be tasty cheese. And here's a cell membrane that shows some molecules moving in and out of it. So proteins have lots and lots of functions that are going on inside of their realm. So here's a long chain of protein. It's made of all those things are different amino acids. So those three-letter words are in fact abbreviations for. So GLN is glycine, or GLU is glutamic acid, or VAL is valine, or HIS is histidine, or PHE is phenylalanine, right? So those are those molecules. When you put them all together, eventually they will fold back on themselves and give proteins a three-dimensional shape, right? So they'll interact with one another. In this case, this molecule formed a globular shape. It's based on the interactions of those different amino acids. So carbon-based molecules made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Three types: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Each have specific functions. They have specific monomers, and they do important jobs for cells. Hope that helps. Ooh, that's quivering. It's a quivering protein.